It is the 9th century BC, and we are on the heights of Mount Carmel, which is a mountain ridge that stretches toward the Mediterranean Sea and overlooks the valleys in northern Israel. The land beneath us is brittle and cracked, because for 3 long years, no rain has fallen across the kingdom. Below, gathered in full view of the nation, is a lone prophet from the wilderness named Elijah. He's facing 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah who have spent the entire day chanting, dancing, and crying out to a God who has given no answer. King Ahab watches from the distance, and the people remain silent, unsure which deity truly rules the skies. Then, Elijah steps forward, as he rebuilds a broken altar of 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel. He pours water over the sacrifice again and again, until even the trench surrounding it is filled. And when he prays and simply asks that the Lord reveal himself, a fire falls from heaven and consumes everything, even the water. But how does a lone man from the hills end up calling fire down before a nation? And what shaped him into that kind of prophet? To find the answer, we have to follow Elijah's story on a map, tracing his path from Gilead, through Sidon, into Samaria, down to Sinai, and finally toward the Jordan River. Because every step across the land reveals how his life was formed long before the fire fell. Our story begins east of the Jordan River, in the rocky highlands of Gilead, where small settlements are scattered among hills and ravines. Somewhere in this region lies Tishbe, the hometown of Elijah the Tishbite. The scriptures tell us nothing about Elijah's family or early life, so he appears in the story without warning, stepping out of obscurity and into the royal court of Israel. At this time, the kingdom of Israel is ruled by King Ahab. Though his political alliances have brought economic strength, they have led to spiritual decline in the land. Through his marriage to Jezebel, a princess from Sidon, the worship of Baal had been promoted across the nation, and altars to the storm god now stand throughout Israel. It is into this setting that Elijah arrives. He travels west across the Jordan River to Samaria, which is the capital of the kingdom, and stands before Ahab with a bold declaration that directly challenges Baal's supposed power over rain and fertility. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand," he proclaims, "there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." At first, people did not notice the absence of dew, but as weeks passed without rain, the severity became clear. Streams shrank, reservoirs dried, livestock weakened, and crops failed, and the land that once thrived under seasonal rains began to deteriorate. And because Elijah has publicly connected the drought to his own prophetic authority, he becomes the immediate target of royal anger. So the Lord instructs him to flee eastward back across the Jordan and into isolation by the brook Cherith, a seasonal stream that flows into the Jordan Valley. Here, hidden within a ravine carved by flowing water, Elijah enters a season of forced isolation. The prophet who once confronted a king now waits alone in the wilderness, sustained entirely by divine provision. Ravens would bring him bread and meat each morning and each evening, and the brook would supply him with water during the early months of the drought. As the days stretch into weeks and the weeks into months, the drought that grips Israel continues to intensify. The effects of it even reach his hiding place. The brook that is beside him dries up completely, and the land around him cracks. At this moment, Elijah realized that the judgment he declared now also threatens his survival, and so he's forced to move again. From the dried ravine of Cherith, Elijah went northwest toward the Mediterranean coast and beyond Israel's borders to Zarephath, the homeland of Queen Jezebel and the center of Baal worship. For Elijah, this journey carries immense risk because he's entering territory loyal to the very queen who seeks his life. Yet as he arrives at the gates of Zarephath, what he encounters is a widow gathering sticks outside the city. It turns out the famine has spread beyond Israel's borders, and she's preparing what she believes will be her final meal for herself and her son. When Elijah asks her for water and then for bread, she explains that she only has a handful of flour and a small jar of oil, barely enough for one last portion before starvation. And yet, Elijah tells her to prepare food for him first, assuring her that the jar of flour will not be emptied and the jug of oil will not fail until rain returns to the land. Despite the uncertainty, she obeyed. And starting from that day, Her supplies did not diminish despite the famine. Day after day, there's enough flour and enough oil for her and her son. Even in the heart of Baal's territory, the God of Israel sustains life quietly and consistently. However, the testing is not finished. After some time, the widow's son falls ill and stops breathing. Grief made her question if Elijah's presence had brought judgment upon her household. As a response, Elijah carries the lifeless child to an upper room to lay him on his own bed and cries out to the Lord, asking him to return the boy's life. And for the first time recorded in scripture, a dead child breathes again. The boy is given back to his mother, and Elijah's authority expands beyond drought and provision, reaching even into the realm of life and death. Meanwhile, back in Israel, 3 years of drought have pushed the nation to the brink. The land of Israel has grown desperate and its people weakened by famine. By this time, the word of the Lord comes again to Elijah and instructs him to return and present himself to King Ahab, for rain will soon be sent upon the earth. And so the prophet leaves Zarephath and travels southward towards Samaria, re-entering the kingdom that has been searching for him. During these years, Ahab has sent messengers to surrounding nations, demanding oaths that Elijah is not being hidden within their borders, yet no one has been able to find him. Now, however, Elijah steps out of hiding and returns to the public scene. On the road, he encounters Obadiah, the steward of Ahab's household, who quietly fears the Lord and has quietly hidden 100 prophets in caves to protect them from Jezebel's purge. When Elijah instructs Obadiah to announce his presence to the king, Obadiah hesitates, as he fears that Elijah might disappear again and cost him his life. Yet Elijah assures him that he will indeed meet Ahab that very day. When Ahab finally sees him, the king greets him with accusation. "Is it you, troubler of Israel?" And Elijah answers with clarity, explaining that the true source of Israel's trouble lies in the abandonment of the Lord's commandments and the promotion of Baal worship under Ahab's authority. It is then that Elijah proposes a national confrontation. He instructs Ahab to gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. However, when the assembly takes place in 1 Kings 18:22-40, only the 450 prophets of Baal are present, and the prophets of Asherah are no longer mentioned. So the showdown on Carmel unfolds solely between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Mount Carmel rises between the coastal plain and the Jezreel Valley, making it a visible and symbolic meeting place. And so the people assemble there in great numbers. Standing before them, Elijah speaks to the nation and asks how long they will hesitate between two loyalties. If the Lord is God, they must follow him. But if Baal is God, then they must follow him. The people say nothing, revealing a nation frozen in divided loyalty. Elijah then outlines the challenge. 2 bulls will be prepared for sacrifice, one for Baal's prophets and one for himself, yet no fire will be set beneath either altar. The God who answers by fire will be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal go first. From morning until noon, they call upon their deity, leaping around the altar and crying out for a response. As the hours pass and no voice is heard, Elijah begins to mock them and suggests that perhaps their God is occupied, traveling, or asleep. Desperation intensifies among the prophets of Baal, and they slash themselves with swords and lances until blood flows freely. But still, they did not receive an answer. As evening approaches, Elijah calls the people near and begins to rebuild an altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He uses 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, thereby reminding the nation of its covenant identity. After placing the wood and the sacrifice upon it, he orders that 4 jars of water be poured over everything. Water runs down and lifts the trench surrounding the altar, and he repeats the pouring until the entire structure is saturated. Then, at the time of the evening offering, Elijah prays a brief and direct prayer, asking that the Lord reveal himself so that the people may know that he alone is God and that their hearts might be turned back. Immediately, fire falls from heaven and consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the smallest dust and drops of water. In that instant, the people fall on their faces and cry out, "The Lord, he is God." Elijah seizes the moment and commands that the prophets of Baal be taken down to the Kishon Valley, where judgment is executed upon them. yet the land is still dry. So Elijah turns once more toward the summit of Carmel, bows low to the ground, and prays for rain. He sends his servant to look toward the sea, and 6 times the servant reports that nothing is visible. However, on the 7th time, a small cloud appears and rises from the horizon like a man's hand. Elijah immediately instructs Ahab to prepare his chariot, for the rain is coming. Soon the sky grows black with clouds and a torrential downpour falls upon the land, ending the drought that had lasted 3 years. As Elijah is strengthened by the power of the Lord, he runs ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel to mark the height of his public triumph. But his victory does not bring the peace he had expected. When Ahab arrives in Jezreel and recounts the events on Mount Carmel to Queen Jezebel, her response is swift and merciless. Rather than repenting, she sends a messenger to Elijah with a vow that tomorrow his life will also be taken just as he took the lives of her prophets. The years of drought, isolation, and spiritual strain had worn Elijah out. He gave in to fear and fled south through Judah to Beersheba, where he left his servant behind and continued alone into the Negev wilderness. There, beneath a lone broom tree in the dry wilderness, Elijah breaks down and asks the Lord to take his life, saying he's no better than his ancestors. As he sleeps, an angel touches him and tells him to get up and eat. Near his head is bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He eats, drinks, and lies down again. But the angel returns a second time and tells him the journey ahead is too much for him without strength. Strengthened by this divine provision, Elijah travels 40 days and 40 nights deeper into the Sinai Peninsula, following a path that echoes Israel's past wanderings, until he arrives at Mount Horeb, or the mountain of God. At Horeb, Elijah enters a cave and spends the night there. That's when the word of the Lord comes down to him with a question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answers with a deep frustration, saying that he has been faithful and zealous for the Lord, while Israel has broken the covenant, torn down the altars, and killed the prophets, leaving him to believe that he's the only one still faithful to God. The Lord then instructs him to stand on the mountain, for he's about to pass by. When Elijah's already on the mountain, a strong wind tears across, yet the Lord is not in the wind. It was then followed by an earthquake and a fire, but the Lord was not in them either. Then a low and gentle whisper comes. When Elijah heard the whisper, he wrapped his face in his cloak and stood at the entrance of the cave. In that stillness, God corrects Elijah's understanding, telling him that 7,000 in Israel have not bowed to Baal. He also gives Elijah new tasks, to appoint Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as the king over Israel, and Elisha as his successor. So the prophet who came to Horeb asking to die leaves with a renewed mission. His journey will now shift once more across the map. Elijah leaves Sinai and returns northward towards Israel's political center. Along the way, he passes through the fertile Jordan Valley and eventually finds a young man named Elisha, son of Shaphat, plowing a field near Abel Meholah. Elijah approaches him without ceremony and throws his cloak over his shoulders, a symbolic act of that time that marks the transfer of prophetic calling. Elisha immediately understands the weight of that gesture, and so, after asking to say farewell to his parents, he slaughters his oxen, burns his plowing equipment for fuel, and prepares a meal for the people, which demonstrates that he is severing ties with his former life. From that moment forward, he follows Elijah and serves him to learn the rhythms of prophetic ministry. Meanwhile, in Jezreel, King Ahab sets his desire on a vineyard near the royal palace that is owned by a man named Naboth. Ahab offers either a better vineyard or fair payment in exchange for the vineyard. Yet Naboth refuses, explaining that the vineyard is his ancestral inheritance protected under Israelite law and covenant tradition. As stated in Leviticus 25:23-28, the land ultimately belongs to the Lord and cannot be permanently sold, because it must remain within the family line. So for Naboth, giving it up would mean violating God's command. Ahab had no choice but to return home resentful and sullen. When Queen Jezebel saw him, she decided to take control of the situation. She plans a scheme by writing letters under Ahab's name, arranging false accusations of blasphemy against Naboth, and ensuring that he was executed outside the city. The plan was done successfully and the vineyard became available for royal possession. As Ahab walks down to take ownership of the land, believing the matter is settled, Elijah stops him in the vineyard itself. Elijah then declares God's judgment, telling Ahab that disaster will strike his house. And in the same place where dogs licked Naboth's blood, the dogs will also lick the king's blood. He also added that Jezebel will die a violent and public death, and that Ahab's dynasty will be completely cut off. For a brief moment, Ahab responds with humility. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and fasts. Because of this temporary repentance, the Lord delays the full destruction until after Ahab's lifetime. Yet the decree has been spoken, and the collapse of the royal house has already begun to take shape. Following Ahab's death in battle, his son Ahaziah ascends to the throne in Samaria. Early in his reign, Ahaziah suffers a severe injury after falling through the lattice of his upper room. Rather than seeking counsel from the Lord, he sends messengers northward to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, asking whether he'll recover. Before those messengers reach their destination, Elijah intercepts them along the road. Standing once more as the guardian of Israel's covenant identity, he questions their mission and instructs them to return to the king with a message. Because Ahaziah has sought guidance from a foreign deity, he will not rise from his bed, but will surely die. When the messengers report this encounter, Ahaziah demands a description of the man who spoke to them. They explain that he was a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist, and the king immediately recognizes that the prophet is Elijah the Tishbite. Determined to assert royal authority, Ahaziah sends a captain with 50 soldiers to arrest him. They found Elijah seated on a hill overlooking the landscape of Israel. The captain commands him to come down in the name of the king. Elijah responds by declaring that if he is indeed a man of God, fire will come down from heaven and consume them. Immediately, fire descends and consumes the entire company. A second captain with another 50 men is sent, and the same fate befalls them when they attempt to capture him with arrogance and force. Finally, a third captain approaches differently. Instead of commanding, he kneels and pleads for mercy, acknowledging Elijah's authority and asking that their lives be spared. This time, the angel of the Lord instructs Elijah to go with him without fear. Elijah then stands before King Ahaziah and repeats the prophecy face to face. Because the king sought counsel from Baal-zebub instead of the Lord, he will not recover. Shortly afterward, Ahaziah dies according to the words spoken. With his final display of divine fire and prophetic authority, Elijah's ministry reaches its climax. The same God who answered with fire on Mount Carmel has again demonstrated his sovereignty over kings and armies. Yet Elijah's journey across the map is nearing its end, and soon it'll take one final unexpected turn toward the Jordan River, a departure unlike any other recorded in Israel's history. As the years of confrontation, drought, fire, and judgment draw to a close, Elijah and Elisha begin their final journey across the land. They move deliberately as if they were marking the sacred ground one last time. They leave Gilgal, travel to Bethel, and continue onward to Jericho. At each stop, Elijah tells Elisha to stay behind, but Elisha refuses, swearing he'll not leave his master. When they arrived at Bethel and Jericho, groups known as the Sons of the Prophets approached quietly, asking Elisha if he knew that the Lord would take Elijah that day. He answers firmly that he knows and urges them to remain silent, keeping the focus on the journey and the work still ahead. Finally, they arrive at the banks of the Jordan River. 50 men from the prophetic community watch from a distance. Elijah rolls up his cloak and strikes the water, and it parts to the right and left, allowing the two men to cross on dry ground. This act recalls earlier moments in Israel's history when God opened waters before his people. Once across, Elijah asks Elisha what he may do for him once he's taken. Elisha requests a double portion of Elijah's spirit, not out of selfishness, but as a rightful inheritance, like a spiritual firstborn. Elijah explains that it is a difficult request, but if Elisha witnesses his ascent, it'll be granted. And then the extraordinary interrupts the ordinary. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appear, separating the two men, and Elijah rises in a whirlwind into heaven. The fire recalls Mount Carmel, the whirlwind recalls Horeb, and the ascent marks a moment unlike any other in Scripture. Elisha cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Recognizing that the true strength of the nation is in God working through his prophet. When the vision fades, Elijah is gone, leaving only his cloak, which transferred his spirit to Elisha. From the hidden hills of Tishbe to the drought-stricken valleys of Samaria, from the heights of Mount Carmel to the quiet caves of Mount Horeb, and from the wilderness of the Negev to the flowing waters of the Jordan River, Elijah's life traces a line across the land as jagged and unpredictable as the man himself. He called down fire from heaven, yet fled in fear. He confronted kings, yet found God in a whisper. He brought famine and judgment, yet brought life back to a widow's son. Elijah's whole journey was all about obedience, faith, and standing for God when others bowed to idols. Every mile he traveled, wilderness he crossed, and confrontation he faced shaped him into the prophet who could shake a nation and yet rely completely on the Lord. Elijah was a man of extremes, and through it all, he proves that God's work is done through those who are willing to stand, even when the world stands against them. Even today, the name Elijah echoes across the map of Israel, as a reminder that a single great prophet once carried the fate of a nation in his hands by his faith in God alone.